Picture a flat, rain-soaked field in southern Holland. November 1944, the sky is the color of dirty wool. American soldiers are moving through the mud, rifles up, breath visible in the cold air, and then, from somewhere ahead, comes that sound, that whistling shriek that every Allied soldier in Europe had learned to fear with every cell in his body. The crack of an 88mm gun, a round cuts the air, another man falls, the 88, the German weapon that could kill a Sherman tank from a mile and a half away, that could reach up and swat Allied bombers from the sky. A gun so accurate, so lethal, so psychologically terrifying that American soldiers across the Western Front referred to it simply as the 88, as if no further explanation was needed, as if the number alone was enough to describe everything terrible about it. But on this particular November day in 1944, something different was about to happen. The men of the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, were about to fight back, not just with their rifles, not just with their own artillery. They were about to capture 3 of those monstrous 88mm guns, and then they were going to turn them around and point them straight back at the men who built them. If you want more stories like this, real history, real heroes, the battles that shaped the world we live in, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. Every week we go deep into the stories that history books never fully tell. Let's go back to where this story really begins, not on the muddy fields of Holland, but in the mountains and desert training camps of Oregon and California, where a remarkable general was building what he believed would be the finest infantry division in the United States Army. His name was Terry de la Mesa Allen, and if you've never heard that name, you're about to understand why you should have. Terry Allen was, by almost any measure, the least likely general in the entire U.S. Army. He had failed out of West Point, not once but twice. His academic record was a disaster. He finished 221st out of 241 students at the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth. His superior officers wrote reports that called him undisciplined, unpredictable, borderline insubordinate. But on a battlefield, Terry Allen was something close to a force of nature. In World War I, he had been shot in the face during a patrol in no man's land and had refused medical evacuation. He stayed at the front. In the interwar years, he led 6 soldiers against 30 armed Mexican cattle rustlers on the border and took them all down. He played polo at the Olympic level. He rode 300 miles on horseback across central Texas in just over 100 hours and won the race. The soldiers who served under him, in any outfit at any time, worshipped him. They called him Terrible Terry, but not because he was cruel. Because on the battlefield he was terrifying to the enemy. He had an instinctive understanding of infantry combat that the textbook generals of his era simply couldn't replicate. In North Africa and Sicily, Allen commanded the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, with savage effectiveness. His men broke the German lines at El Gueta. They spearheaded the invasion of Sicily. Under his leadership, the 1st Division became arguably the most combat-effective American unit in the Mediterranean theater. And then, in one of the stranger decisions of the war, General Omar Bradley fired him. The Yatan. Official reasons were murky. Lack of discipline, too close to his men, not army enough in his bearing. Some historians believe it was simply that Terry Allen was getting too much credit, too much press, while the generals above him were not. Whatever the reason, Allen was sent home. His career, many assumed, was over, but Army Chief of Staff George Marshall disagreed. Marshall had watched Allen fight. He had seen what the man could do. And in October 1943, Marshall gave him a second chance. Command of a new division, the 104th Infantry, then training at Camp Adair in Oregon. Terry Allen had been humiliated, discarded, and written off. Now he had a new pack of wolves to train, and he was going to make them unlike any other division in the U.S. Army. He had learned something in North Africa that most American commanders still hadn't fully absorbed. Night attacks work, when you assault the enemy in total darkness, when you strip away the air cover advantage and the artillery spotting advantage and force the fight, down to men in the black in the mud with nothing but their training and their nerve, and you can break a defense that would cost you enormously in daylight. So that's what Allen built. Division of Nightfighters. He required his men to train 30 to 35 hours a week on nighttime operations. The Army standard was 8 to 12 hours. Allen's Timberwolves were operating in darkness for more than 4 times the normal requirement. They learned to navigate by starlight, to communicate without radios, using hand signals and pre-planned signals they had memorized, to use the enemy's own fear of the dark against him. The motto he gave them said everything. Nothing in hell can stop the Timberwolves. By the time the 104th Infantry Division sailed from New York Harbor on August 27, 1944, they were a different kind of American unit. They were lean, hard, and trained to fight in a way that the Germans had never quite encountered before. The 104th landed in France on September 7, 1944. The Allied breakout from Normandy was in full swing. Paris had just been liberated. The war seemed, to many optimistic observers, almost over. There were generals betting on being home by Christmas. Terry Allen was not among them. He knew better. His first stop after landing was not a briefing room or a headquarters. It was the American military cemetery at Normandy. He went to visit the grave of his old friend, Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt, Jr., the son of the former president, who had famously waded ashore at Utah Beach on D-Day and been killed by a heart attack 5 weeks later. The two men had led the 1st Division together. Roosevelt had been fired alongside Allen in Sicily. His death hit Allen hard at the gravesite. Allen stood in silence for several minutes, then he turned back to his division. There was work to be done. The 104th moved northeast, joining the enormous Allied push toward Germany. On October 23, 1944, the Timberwolves entered combat, initially attached to the British and Canadian forces of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, helping clear the Scheldt Estuary in Belgium and the Netherlands. What happened next immediately set the 104th apart. The terrain of southern Holland was miserable, flat, waterlogged, crisscrossed with canals and dikes. The Germans knew every ditch, every farmhouse, every sightline. They had established strong points using mines, booby traps, hand roadblocks, and in multiple positions along the American axis of advance, they had positioned their most terrifying weapons, the 88mm flak guns. The German 88 was not merely a gun. It was an icon of German military engineering and an instrument of Allied nightmares, originally designed in the late 1920s as an anti-aircraft weapon, technically prohibited under the Versailles Treaty, which is why it was secretly developed by Krupp, engineers working through a Swedish front company. The 88mm Flak 18 had proven its worth in the Spanish Civil War. By World War II, it had been refined through multiple generations into the Flak 36 and 37, and eventually the devastating Flak 41. What made the 88 so remarkable was its dual-purpose nature. It could reach up and destroy, bombers flying at 35,000 feet, but it could also be depressed to horizontal and used as a tank killer of unmatched capability. Its high-velocity, 88-meter round would punch through the armor of any Allied tank at normal combat ranges. The Sherman, the Churchill, the Cromwell, and none of them were safe at distances where the 88 could see them. Paul Fazel, the American cultural historian and WW2 combat veteran, later wrote that the 88 was the single greatest conventional weapon of the entire war. American tankers had a name for the paralysis it caused. They called it 88 fever. You heard that distinctive crack and boom and your blood ran cold. In November 1944, as the Timberwolves pushed through southern Holland, they encountered a cluster of these weapons, exactly 3 82mm guns, positioned to cover an axis of advance, capable of destroying armor and shredding infantry with equal efficiency. In the daylight against entrenched 88mm positions, an attacking infantry unit faced terrible odds. Those guns could traverse quickly, fire accurately, and devastate a column in minutes, but the Timberwolves were not a daylight division. Major General Allen had trained his men for exactly this kind of fight, and in the darkness of a November night the Americans moved, quietly, methodically, in small groups, closing the distance with the German gun positions before the crews had time to react. The details of the fight itself, the crawling through wet grass, the precise coordination in total darkness, the sudden violent close quarters, assault on the German positions were the product of months of intensive training back in Oregon. What Allen had built was not simply soldiers who could fight at night. He had built soldiers who were more dangerous at night than in daylight. The German crews fought back. Men fell on both sides in the darkness, but when the shooting stopped, the 80mm guns were silent, and they belonged to the Timberwolves. Now came the decision that gave this story its particular flavor of American ingenuity. 3 massive German guns intact, with ammunition still available. In the ordinary course of things, a captured weapon like this gets disabled. The breech destroyed, the barrel spiked, and left behind. You don't want the enemy recapturing it and turning it on you. But the Timberwolves had a different idea. These weren't ordinary infantrymen when it came to improvisation. Allen had trained them to use everything available, to adapt, to exploit any advantage the battlefield offered. Some of his men had artillery training, others were simply quick learners, and the German 88, for all its reputation as an instrument of Allied destruction, was in many ways a beautifully simple piece of engineering. A trained crew could learn its operation faster than you might expect. The Timberwolves didn't spike those guns, they turned them around. 3 German 88mm cannons pointed back toward the German lines operated by American hands, now firing German ammunition against the men who had built them. It was a moment of profound battlefield poetry. The weapon designed to terrorize Allied soldiers was now terrorizing German ones, and the Germans had no idea that the sound they feared, that familiar crack of their own guns, was now coming from the wrong direction. This was not an isolated impulse. Across the 104th's area of operations, a similar mentality prevailed. The division soldiers also captured and pressed into service a Sturmgeschütz III, a German self-propelled assault gun, which soldiers of the 57th Anti-Tank platoon operated against their former owners as late as December 1944. The National Archives photograph of that moment still exists. American GIs in Wehrmacht-manufactured, steel-pointing German guns at Germans. It was the Timberwolf way. While the capture of the 88s was a remarkable tactical episode, it was only a small chapter in the brutal story of the Timberwolves campaign across northwestern Europe. After the fighting in Holland, the 104th transferred to the American First Army's 7th Corps and took up positions near the German city of Aachen, the first major German city to fall to Allied forces. Aachen itself had already been captured, but the Timberwolves were now pushing east toward the Roer River through the industrial heartland of Western Germany, fighting through the heavily fortified cities of Stolberg, Eschweiler, and Inden. This is where Allen's night fighting doctrine proved its full value. The Germans had designed their defensive positions, the interlocking bunkers, the Siegfried Line fortifications, the artillery kill zones, to maximize the advantage of daylight. German doctrine, like most conventional military thinking of the era, assumed that major attacks came in daylight with air cover and artillery. Preparation. Allen attacked at night, without the aircraft, frequently without extensive artillery. Preparation. To preserve the element of surprise, sometimes with empty rifles and only grenades and bayonets, because in the dark, at close range, a rifle shot gives away your position, but a grenade or a bayonet does not. The results were extraordinary. Eschweiler fell on November 21st. By early December, all German strongpoints west of the Roer River had been cleared. Lieutenant General J. Lawton Collins, commander of 7th Corps, personally praised the division's leadership dash and sound training. The British and Canadian officers who had worked with the Timberwolves earlier in Holland had sent formal letters of admiration to General Allen, who had distributed copies to every regiment. Then came December 1944 and the Ardennes. On December 16, Adolf Hitler launched his last great offensive in the West. The German counterattack through the Ardennes, what Americans would come to call the Battle of the Bulge, tore a massive hole in the Allied line. The 104th found itself not in the path of the main German thrust, but on the northern shoulder of the battle, holding defensive positions along the Roer River near Düren and Merken. For 2 months the Timberwolves held. The German tide came and receded, and when it was over, when the last German offensive in the west had spent itself against the Allied lines, the time for the great push into Germany proper had finally arrived. February 23, 1945, 3:30 in the morning. The largest artillery barrage ever assembled by the U.S. Army in the European theater erupted along the Roer River. Over 1,000 thalers, guns opened fire simultaneously. For 45 minutes, the west bank of the Roer was pure noise and light and death. Then the Timberwolves crossed. Operation Grenade. The American crossing of the Roer was a joint operation involving multiple divisions of the 9th Army. The 104th was part of the Southern 99th Corps, pushing northeast toward the Rhine. The sea, Roer itself, was swollen and fast-moving. The Germans had blown their own dams upstream to flood the river and buy time. The assault crossing was as dangerous as almost any other operation of the war. But they made it. And once across, the 104th did what Timberwolves do. They attacked. Fast, aggressive, continuous, night after night, town after town, Huchem-Stammeln, Berkersdorf, North Düren. The division moved northeast along the highway toward Cologne, Germany's third-largest city, the ancient metropolis on the Rhine that had been turned into a landscape of rubble and ghosts by 262 Allied bombing raids. By March 2, American forces were fighting on the outskirts of Cologne. The city was defended not just by German soldiers, but by the fanatical SS, by Volkssturm militia, by 80mm guns positioned to cover every major approach, and by prowling Tiger tanks in the ruined streets. The battle for Cologne lasted 3 days, house to house, ruin to ruin. The Timberwolves and the 3rd Armored Division fought through streets that had been bombed almost beyond recognition. The famous Cologne Cathedral, as somehow still standing despite everything around it being destroyed, watched over the fighting like a survivor from another age. By March 7, 1945, German resistance in Cologne collapsed. The city was in American hands. The 104th Infantry Division had taken the 3rd largest city in Germany. But the war wasn't over. Not by a long way. On March 22nd, the Timberwolves crossed the Rhine at Honnef, a night operation, of course, attacking from the east side of the Remagen bridgehead. The 104th and the 3rd Armored Division launched one of the most remarkable advances of the entire Western Front campaign. In 9 days, they covered 193 miles in 9 days, across rivers, through German towns, against whatever resistance the Wehrmacht could throw in their path. The 193-mile dash ended at Paderborn, where the 104th linked up with the U.S. 9th Army to complete the encirclement of the Ruhr pocket, the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany, now surrounded by Allied forces. 335,000 German soldiers would eventually surrender. It was the largest surrender on the Western Front. Then the division swung east again, 175 more miles in 15 days, across the Weser River, across the Saale into central Germany. And on April 11th, 1945, the Timberwolves arrived at Nordhausen. What they found there would stay with every man who saw it for the rest of his life. Nordhausen was the site of the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp, a place where the Nazi regime had used slave labor to manufacture V-2 rockets in underground tunnels blasted from the Harz Mountains. The prisoners, mostly Soviet and Polish, along with Jews, political prisoners, and anyone else the Reich had decided to consume, had worked in conditions of almost incomprehensible brutality. In the tunnels in the dark for 12 to 16 hours a day with inadequate food, clothing, and sanitation, they had built weapons that would rain down on London and Antwerp. When the 104th arrived, they found 3,000 corpses lying in the open. Some prisoners were still alive, barely. The SS had evacuated most of the remaining inmates on forced death marches before the Americans arrived, but around 750 emaciated survivors remained. Many of the Timberwolves were young men from the Ardsy American West, from Oregon and Washington, from small towns and farms. Nothing in their lives, nothing in any life, could have prepared them for what they were seeing. Soldiers who had fought for months, without flinching, broke down and wept. Some stood in silence, unable to process what they were witnessing. Major General Allen ordered the surrounding German civilian population to come to Nordhausen and see what had been done in their name. Some Germans claimed they had not known. The bodies spoke for themselves. The 104th Infantry Division had been recognized later as a liberating division by the U.S. Army Center of Military History and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It is one of 36 U.S. divisions to hold that designation. The advance continued. On April 15th, the Timberwolves began a bitter 5-day battle for the city of Halle on the Saale River. The city fell on April 19th. By April 21st, the division had cleared the sector east to the Mulde River, and then on April 26, 1945, at 1:05 in the afternoon, the Timberwolves made visual contact with soldiers of the Red Army at Presidio on the Mulde River. 195 days of continuous combat. That is how long the 104th Infantry Division had been in the fight, from their first engagement in Belgium on October 23, 1944 to this moment. 195 days without ever giving ground, not once in the entire campaign. The division had fought through Holland, through the Siegfried Line, through the Roer and the Rhine, through the industrial cities of Western Germany, through the horror of Nordhausen, and all the way to the heart of the continent. 473 Timberwolves had been killed in action. More than 4,000 had been wounded. 19 were still missing. In return, the 104th had killed approximately 18,000 German soldiers and captured 51,124 more. 2 Timberwolves had earned the Medal of Honor, Private Willie F. James, Jr. for scouting German positions under machine gun fire, and Cecil H. Bolton, who led his company into the attack, despite wounds from a mortar shell. And on May 7, 1945, at a ceremony in a small French schoolhouse in Reims, Germany's high command signed the unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Now step back for a moment, step back from the battle maps and the casualty figures, and ask a simple question. What does this story mean? The capture and turning of those 3 German 88mm guns in Holland is one episode in a 195-day campaign. It lasted perhaps a few hours. In the scale of the entire war, it barely registers, but it contains in miniature everything that the Timberwolves were about. It was improvisation, the willingness to look at a situation differently than the doctrine said you should. The 88mm gun was a symbol of German technological superiority, of German industrial power, of the vast weight of the Wehrmacht's war machine. For years, Allied soldiers had died in the shadow of those guns. They had watched tanks brew up and burn. They had heard the scream of incoming rounds and prayed. And then a group of American infantrymen, as trained by an unconventional general who himself had been written off, discarded, told that his career was finished, looked at 3 of those guns in the darkness and thought, we can use those. Not destroy them. Use them. It's a story about a particular kind of American military character that existed in World War II, one that has perhaps faded somewhat from the modern military imagination. It was the character of men who had grown up during the Depression, who understood scarcity, who had learned to fix things rather than throw them away, who had developed a deep-seated aversion to waste in any form. When you find a tool, you use it. When the enemy leaves a weapon behind, you don't spike it, you learn it, you turn it around, you fire it back. There's also something deeply satisfying and on a fundamental, human level about that moment. The Germans who survived the attack of their own 88s in that November darkness must have heard those guns fire and felt a cold confusion. The sound was right, the weapon was theirs, but the rounds were coming from the wrong direction. Their own instrument of terror had been turned against them. General Terry. Allen understood this kind of warfare. He had been humiliated by the system, removed by men who thought warfare was about polish and paperwork. And he had taken his division and done what he always did, found an unconventional approach, trained people who believed in it and executed it with savage precision. The Timberwolves' motto was, "Nothing in hell can hide it." Stop the Timberwolves. In 195 days of combat, not a single thing did. After the war, the men of the 104th came home. Some of them, like future New York City Mayor Ed Koch, future New York Governor Hugh Carey, and screenwriter Paddy Chayefsky, who would go on to write Network, carried the experience with them into remarkable civilian lives. Rabbi Gunther Plaut, a Holocaust survivor himself who served with the division, later became one of the most important religious figures in North American Judaism. Terry Allen retired in 1946. He died on September 12, 1969, in El Paso, Texas. He is buried at Fort Bliss National Cemetery alongside his son, Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen Jr., who was killed leading an infantry battalion in Vietnam in 1967, fighting in the same division his father had commanded in World War II. The Big Red One. The Army has that kind of continuity in it. If you look, the 104th Infantry Division still exists today in a sense as the 104th Training Division, part of the United States Army Reserve. Headquartered at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State, the patch is still a gray wolf's head on green. The name is still Timberwolves. Whether the new generation of soldiers knows the full story of what that patch means and what it cost, what it represents, is a question worth asking. 195 days, 1,473 dead, 51,724 prisoners. 3. Charity Mace guns pointed back at the men who built them in the darkness of a November night in Holland, 1944. Nothing in hell stopped them. Nothing. That's the story of the Timberwolves and their captured 80 meets. Guns, if this moved you, if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, please subscribe to this channel, hit the like button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Every week we bring you history that matters. History with weight, history with names and faces and the kind of detail that makes you feel like you were there. The men who lived these stories deserve no less. We'll see you next time.